The kingdom of Judah stood at a crossroads in the late 7th century before Christ, caught between the dying gasps of one empire and the rising hunger of another. To the casual observer, the nation might have appeared stable, even prosperous. The temple in Jerusalem still drew worshippers for the appointed festivals. The priests still offered sacrifices on the great altar. The king still sat on David's throne, maintaining the dynasty that God had promised would endure forever. But beneath the surface of religious observance and political continuity, a rot had spread so deeply through Judah's soul that only divine intervention could reveal its extent, and only divine judgment could address it. The year was approximately 627 BCE, the 13th year of King Josiah's reign, and the geopolitical landscape was shifting in ways that would reshape the entire ancient Near East. Assyria, that brutal empire that had dominated the region for centuries, that had swallowed the northern kingdom of Israel whole and scattered its 10 tribes across distant provinces, was finally weakening. The great city of Nineveh, whose very name had struck terror into the hearts of smaller nations, would fall within 2 decades, its walls breached, its palaces burned, its legendary cruelty brought to an end so complete that later generations would struggle to locate its ruins. But Assyria's decline did not mean peace for Judah. Into the vacuum left by the fading empire, new powers were rushing to claim dominance. Babylon, that ancient city on the Euphrates that had once ruled Mesopotamia under Hammurabi, was stirring again under a new dynasty. Nabopolassar had thrown off Assyrian control and was building a military force that would soon prove irresistible. His son, not yet known to history but destined to become Nebuchadnezzar the Great, was growing toward manhood, preparing for conquests that would create an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. And Egypt itself was watching, calculating, preparing to exploit the chaos to its north. Pharaoh Nekhotep would soon march his armies through the land bridge that Judah occupied, claiming the right of passage, drawing Judah into conflicts that were not its own. The tiny kingdom found itself squeezed between great powers, a small piece on a vast game board where the players were empires and the stakes were survival itself. King Josiah was a good man, perhaps the best king Judah had known since David himself. He had come to the throne as a child of 8, inheriting a kingdom corrupted by his grandfather Manasseh's 55 years of apostasy. Manasseh had filled Jerusalem with altars to foreign gods, had practiced sorcery and divination, had even sacrificed his own son in the fire to Moloch in the valley of Hinnom. The spiritual devastation of those decades could not be undone quickly, no matter how sincere the reforms that followed, and Josiah's reforms were sincere. In the 18th year of his reign, still a few years in the future from where our story begins, workers repairing the temple would discover a scroll that had been lost or hidden during the dark years of Manasseh's reign. When the words of that scroll were read to Josiah, he would tear his robes in grief, recognizing how far Judah had strayed from the covenant their ancestors had made with Yealf. He would launch the most sweeping religious reformation in Judah's history, tearing down the high places, removing the Asherah poles, executing the priests who had served at pagan altars, centralizing all worship in Jerusalem as the law of Moses required. But reforms imposed from above do not necessarily change hearts below. The people went through the motions of renewed devotion, attended the restored festivals, offered the prescribed sacrifices, but too many of them did so while continuing to worship other gods in private, while maintaining household shrines to the Queen of Heaven, while trusting in fertility rituals and divination practices that the law explicitly forbade. The Reformation was real, but it was also superficial. It changed the landscape of public worship without transforming the interior landscape of the nation's soul. This was the Judah into which the prophetic word was about to break, a kingdom that looked righteous from the outside while remaining rotten within, a people who honoured God with their lips while their hearts remained far from him. The temple stood magnificent on its hill, but the prayers offered there rose from mouths that had also whispered to Baal. The sacrifices burned on the altar, but the hands that brought them had also poured libations to gods of wood and stone. The covenant was remembered in public ceremony and violated in private practice. The nation was living a lie, and the lie was about to be exposed. In the priestly village of Anathoth, about 3 miles north of Jerusalem, a young man was growing toward adulthood with no particular awareness that his life was about to change forever. His name was Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, and he came from a family whose roots in Israel's religious leadership stretched back generations. Anathoth was a Levitical city, one of the towns assigned to the descendants of Aaron for their dwelling, a community where priestly traditions were preserved and priestly duties were prepared for. The young men of Anathoth grew up expecting to serve in the temple, to offer sacrifices, to teach the law, to maintain the religious infrastructure that connected Judah to its God. Jeremiah knew the traditions. He had learned the stories of Abraham and Moses, of the Exodus and the conquest, of David's kingdom and Solomon's temple. He had absorbed the rhythm of the religious calendar, the meaning of the festivals, the significance of the sacrificial system. He could recite portions of the law and explain their application. His education had been thorough, his formation careful, his preparation for a life of priestly service well advanced. But there was something else in Jeremiah, something that distinguished him from the other young men preparing for conventional religious careers. He was sensitive in ways that made life both richer and more painful. He noticed things that others overlooked: the gap between public piety and private behaviour, the hollowness beneath the surface of ritual observance, the slow decay of a society that had lost its spiritual foundations while maintaining its religious forms. He felt things deeply, perhaps too deeply for comfort. The suffering of the poor troubled him. The arrogance of the powerful offended him. The casual hypocrisy of religious leaders who should have known better wounded him in ways he could not fully articulate. He was also introspective, given to long periods of thought and prayer, more comfortable in solitude than in crowds, more inclined to observe than to participate. Some might have called him shy, others might have seen his quietness as aloofness. But those who knew him best recognized something else, a depth of perception that went beyond his years, an attunement to spiritual realities that others seemed oblivious to, a capacity for communion with God that would prove essential for the burden he was about to receive. The tension between what Jeremiah saw in his society and what he knew of his God was growing unbearable. He saw the idols on the rooftops of Jerusalem, the small shrines where families burned incense to astral deities, seeking blessing from the stars while ignoring the one who made them. He saw the corruption in the courts, where justice was sold to the highest bidder and the poor had no advocate. He saw the priests who were supposed to teach the law using their positions for personal gain, and the prophets who spoke smooth words of peace when there was no peace. He saw a nation sleepwalking toward catastrophe, convinced of its own security, confident that the temple's presence guaranteed divine protection, regardless of how the people lived. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the people would chant as if the building itself were a magical talisman that would ward off all harm. They did not understand, or refused to understand, that the God who dwelt in that temple was not a tribal deity who could be manipulated through proper ritual, but the creator of heaven and earth who demanded righteousness as well as sacrifice, justice as well as worship, hearts transformed as well as knees bent. Jeremiah watched and grieved and prayed, but he did not yet speak. He was too young, too uncertain, too aware of his own inadequacy to imagine that he might have any role to play in addressing the crisis he perceived. He was not a prophet, not yet. He was simply a young man with eyes to see and a heart to feel and had no idea what to do with either. The world around him continued its dangerous drift. In the great cities of Mesopotamia, armies were being assembled that would one day march toward Jerusalem. In the palaces of Egypt, plans were being laid that would draw Judah into fatal entanglements. In the throne rooms of Assyria, the last emperors of a dying dynasty struggled to hold together an empire that was crumbling from within and assaulted from without. The forces that would shape Jeremiah's entire ministry were already in motion, the collision course already set, the catastrophe already approaching, even though decades would pass before it arrived. And in Anathoth, in a home that belonged to priests, in a community that maintained traditions reaching back centuries, a young man went about his ordinary days without knowing that his days of ordinariness were numbered. He could not have guessed that he had been chosen before his birth for a task that would consume his entire adult life. He could not have imagined that the sensitivity he sometimes wished he could shed was actually preparation for a calling that would require exactly that capacity to feel what others refused to feel. He could not have known that the God he worshipped in the quietness of his heart was preparing to speak to him with a directness and an intimacy that would change everything. The nation was on the brink of collapse, though it would take 40 more years for the collapse to become visible. The people were racing toward judgment, though they remained convinced they were secure. The religious establishment was failing its fundamental purpose, though it continued to function with impressive efficiency. Everything looked stable, and nothing was stable. Everything seemed permanent, and everything was about to change. Somewhere in the heavens, the word of the Lord was forming, a word that would soon descend upon a young man who did not feel ready to receive it. The calling that had been prepared before Jeremiah's birth was about to intersect with the life he was actually living. The purpose for which he had been set apart in his mother's womb was about to be revealed. He did not know it yet. He was simply living his life, observing his world, feeling the tensions that others seemed not to feel, praying prayers that had not yet received their answer. He was ordinary in every visible way, unremarkable to those who didn't look beneath the surface. But God had been looking beneath the surface since before Jeremiah existed. God had seen what Jeremiah would become, had known what Jeremiah would suffer, had planned what Jeremiah would speak. The young man in Anathoth was not as unknown as he felt. He was not as unprepared as he feared. He was not as ordinary as he appeared. He was a prophet waiting to be awakened, a voice preparing to speak, a servant about to receive his commission, and the word of the Lord was coming. It would arrive not with thunder and lightning, not with cosmic spectacle, but with a quiet clarity that would prove more overwhelming than any storm. It would speak to Jeremiah of things he had never imagined, of a calling that stretched back before his conception and forward beyond his death, of a purpose that would cost him everything and give him something that nothing could take away. The nation stood on the brink. The young man waited in Anathoth, and God, who sees the end from the beginning, was about to set in motion a prophetic ministry that would echo through millennia, speaking words that would outlast the very kingdom they were given to warn. The calling was coming, and nothing, not youth, not fear, not inadequacy, not the opposition of an entire nation, would be able to stop what God had determined before the foundation of the world. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah son of Hilkiah, and it came not with the spectacular displays that had accompanied other divine revelations in Israel's history. There was no burning bush that refused to be consumed, no pillar of fire descending from heaven, no earthquake or whirlwind or thundering voice from a mountain shrouded in smoke. The setting was ordinary, perhaps Jeremiah's home in Anathoth, perhaps a quiet place where he had gone to pray, perhaps simply a moment in the course of an unremarkable day, when the unremarkable suddenly shattered into something that would reshape his entire existence. What came was presence. Overwhelming, unmistakable, inescapable presence. The God who had seemed distant in corporate worship, who had felt like an abstraction discussed in priestly instruction, who had been honoured in ritual and tradition but never encountered with this devastating directness. That God was suddenly, terrifyingly, beautifully present. Jeremiah found himself not thinking about God but standing before him, not contemplating the divine but being contemplated by the divine, not seeking but being found by one who had apparently been seeking him since before he drew his first breath. And then the words came, entering Jeremiah's consciousness with a clarity that left no room for doubt about their source. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. The Hebrew word for knew carried depths that the simple English translation cannot fully convey. This was not mere intellectual awareness, not the kind of knowing that catalogues facts and organizes information. This was intimate knowledge, the knowing of relationship, the knowing that exists between persons who have shared life together. God was not saying merely that he had been aware of Jeremiah's future existence. He was saying that he had known Jeremiah, had been in relationship with him, had loved him, had engaged with his particular personhood, before the physical processes of conception had even begun. The implications were staggering. Jeremiah's existence was not an accident of biology, not the random result of natural processes that happened to produce a particular combination of traits and tendencies. He had been known before he was formed. The God, who stood outside of time, who saw the end from the beginning, who held all of history in his sovereign hands, had known this specific young man from Anathoth before the young man existed to be known. The relationship that Jeremiah was only now becoming aware of had been real on God's side since before time itself. Before you were born, I set you apart. The setting apart was consecration, dedication to a particular purpose, the marking of something or someone as belonging to God in a special way. The vessels used in temple worship were set apart, ordinary metal transformed into sacred instruments by their dedication to divine service. The Levites were set apart, one tribe among 12 designated for religious duties that the other tribes did not share. The Sabbath was set apart, one day among 7 marked as holy, different from the others, belonging to God in a way the other days did not. And Jeremiah had been set apart before his birth. While he was still in his mother's womb, while the physical form that would carry his consciousness through life was still being knit together in the darkness of gestation, he had already been consecrated. The purpose that was now being revealed to him was not a late addition to his life, not an assignment being given to someone who happened to be available. It was the fulfillment of a designation that had been made before he breathed, before he cried, before he opened his eyes to the light of the world he would spend his life trying to save from itself. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. A prophet. The word carried weight that pressed down on Jeremiah's shoulders even as he heard it. Prophets in Israel were not fortune-tellers or predictors of the future in the sense that pagan cultures understood such roles. They were spokesmen for God, mouths through which divine truth entered human discourse, bridges between heaven's perspective and earth's confusion. To be a prophet was to stand in the counsel of the Lord, to hear what God was saying, and then to speak that word to people who usually did not want to hear it. The prophetic tradition in Israel was glorious. Moses, Samuel, Elijah, Elisha. But it was also painful. Prophets were rejected, persecuted, sometimes killed. They spoke uncomfortable truths to powerful people and suffered the consequences, and not just a prophet to Judah, to his own people, to the small kingdom where he had been raised, a prophet to the nations. The scope of the calling expanded beyond anything Jeremiah could have imagined. Whatever message he would carry would have implications not just for Jerusalem and its environs, but for the entire stage on which international affairs played out. Babylon, Egypt, Assyria, the smaller kingdoms that dotted the landscape of the ancient Near East, all of them would somehow be touched by words that would emerge from this young man's mouth. Jeremiah's response was immediate and visceral. The words that burst from his lips were not calculated or composed. They were the raw overflow of a heart suddenly confronted with a burden it felt utterly incapable of bearing. Alas, sovereign Lord, I don't know how to speak. I am too young. The Hebrew word translated alas was an exclamation of distress, a cry that expressed the impossibility of what was being asked. It was the sound a person makes when they have been given a weight too heavy to lift, a task too great to accomplish, a responsibility too vast to comprehend. Jeremiah was not being humble in some calculated, self-deprecating way. He was being honest about his genuine sense of inadequacy, about the enormous gap he perceived between what God was asking and what he was capable of providing. I do not know how to speak. For a calling that would centre on speaking, on proclaiming divine truth, on confronting kings and priests and people with messages they did not want to hear, this confession was devastating. Jeremiah was not an orator. He had not been trained in the rhetorical arts. He was not the kind of person who commanded attention when he entered a room, or who could bend audiences to his will through the power of persuasion. He was quiet, introspective, more comfortable observing than participating. The skills that the calling seemed to require were precisely the skills he felt most lacking. I am too young. The exact age of Jeremiah at his calling is not specified in the text, but he was clearly young enough that his youth felt like a disqualifying characteristic. In a culture that valued the wisdom of age, that looked to elders for guidance, that associated prophetic authority with grey hair and accumulated experience, what could a young man possibly offer? Who would listen to someone who had not yet lived long enough to earn the right to speak? The established religious leaders, the powerful political figures, the people comfortable in their assumptions. Why would any of them pay attention to a youth from a village 3 miles outside the capital? The objections were real. They were not excuses invented to avoid an unpleasant duty. Jeremiah genuinely felt incapable of what was being asked. His sense of inadequacy was not false modesty, but accurate self-assessment, at least accurate from a human perspective that did not factor in what God was capable of doing through vessels that seemed too weak for the tasks assigned to them. This pattern of divine calling followed by human objection echoed through the history of God's dealings with those he chose for significant tasks. Moses had protested that he was slow of speech and tongue, and God had provided Aaron as a mouthpiece, while insisting that Moses remain the leader. Gideon had insisted that his clan was the weakest in Manasseh, and he was the least in his family, and God had reduced his army to 300 men to prove that divine power did not depend on human strength. The pattern suggested something about how God worked, choosing the unlikely, the unprepared, the inadequate, and then demonstrating through their ministry that the power belonged to him rather than to them. But knowing the pattern intellectually did not make it easier to experience personally. Jeremiah stood in the presence of God with his objections spoken, his inadequacy confessed, his fear laid bare, waiting to see whether the calling would be withdrawn, or the excuse accepted, or some alternative arrangement proposed. Perhaps God would find someone else, someone older, someone more eloquent, someone better suited to the enormous task that had been described. Perhaps this had been a test of some kind, a probing of Jeremiah's spiritual condition that he had somehow failed or passed in ways he did not understand. But the calling was not withdrawn. The excuse was not accepted. No alternative arrangement was proposed. Instead, God pressed deeper into the very objections Jeremiah had raised, not dismissing them as irrelevant, but addressing them with a directness that would leave no room for continued resistance. The young man who felt too young, too inarticulate, too inadequate for prophetic ministry, was about to discover that divine callings do not depend on human qualifications. The God who had known him before his birth had never been under any illusions about his limitations. Those limitations had been factored into the calling from the beginning, not as obstacles to be overcome by Jeremiah's efforts, but as contexts in which divine power would be displayed. The conversation was not over. The calling was not retracted. God had more to say to his reluctant prophet, words that would transform objection into commission, fear into faith, inadequacy into availability. Jeremiah's excuses had been heard, and they were about to be answered in ways that would make refusal impossible and obedience, however terrified, the only viable path forward. What the young man did not yet understand was that his very reluctance qualified him for the task ahead. A prophet who was confident in his own abilities would be tempted to trust those abilities rather than God. A spokesman who was proud of his eloquence might rely on rhetorical skill rather than divine truth. A messenger who felt adequate to the task might begin to believe that the power of the message came from himself rather than from the one who sent him. Jeremiah's sense of inadequacy, painful as it was, would prove to be one of his greatest assets. It would keep him dependent on God throughout a ministry that would span decades. It would prevent the pride that had destroyed other servants of God. It would maintain in him the humility necessary to speak divine words without the contamination of human arrogance. But all of that lay in the future. In this moment, Jeremiah simply waited, trembling for whatever God would say next. The calling had been spoken. The objection had been raised, and the one who had known him before birth was about to show him that the calling was not a request to be negotiated, but a commission to be received. Not an invitation that could be politely declined, but an appointment that had been made in eternity and would be fulfilled in time. The young man who did not know how to speak was about to be taught. The one who felt too young was about to be equipped, and the prophet to the nations was about to receive the words that would define his ministry, his suffering, and his legacy across millennia yet to come. God's response to Jeremiah's objections came not with impatience but with authority, not with frustration, but with the gentle firmness of one who knows exactly what he is doing and will not be deterred by the fears of those he has chosen. The young man had spoken his inadequacy into the presence of the Almighty, and now the Almighty spoke back, addressing each element of Jeremiah's protest with words that would make continued resistance impossible. Do not say, "I am too young." The prohibition was direct and left no room for negotiation. God was not inviting Jeremiah to discuss his self-assessment, not opening a dialogue about whether youth was indeed a disqualifying characteristic, not suggesting that perhaps they could revisit this calling in a few years when Jeremiah felt more prepared. He was commanding his prophet to stop using age as an excuse. The very words that Jeremiah had spoken, "I am too young," were now forbidden to him. He was not permitted to continue speaking them, not allowed to hide behind them, not authorized to use them as a shield against the calling that had been placed upon his life. The command revealed something profound about how God viewed human limitations. From Jeremiah's perspective, his youth was an objective fact, a genuine obstacle, a reasonable explanation for why someone else should be chosen for this task. From God's perspective, Jeremiah's youth was simply one of many factors that had been considered and accounted for long before the calling was issued. The God who had known Jeremiah before his formation in the womb had never been surprised by how old the prophet would be at the moment of his commissioning. The youth that felt like a barrier to Jeremiah was not a barrier to God. It was simply a circumstance within which divine power would operate. "You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you." The scope of the commission expanded even as Jeremiah's objections were being dismantled. Not just some people, but everyone God would send him to. Not just messages Jeremiah felt comfortable delivering, but whatever God commanded him to say. The calling was comprehensive, leaving no corner of Jeremiah's life or ministry outside divine direction. He was not being given a limited assignment that he could complete and then return to normal life. He was being conscripted into a service that would govern his movements, his words, his very identity for the rest of his earthly existence. The requirement to go wherever, sent and say whatever commanded addressed the heart of prophetic ministry. A prophet was not a freelance spiritual consultant who could choose his clients and craft his messages for maximum audience approval. A prophet was a servant under orders, a messenger whose value lay precisely in his faithfulness to deliver what he'd been given regardless of how it was received. The moment a prophet began editing divine messages to make them more palatable, he ceased to function as a prophet and became something else, a religious entertainer perhaps, or a political consultant dressed in spiritual clothing. Jeremiah was being warned from the very beginning that his calling would require absolute surrender of his preferences, his fears, his desire for approval. He would go where God sent, period. He would say what God commanded, period. There would be no negotiations, no exceptions, no escape clauses in the contract that was being established between the Lord of hosts and his reluctant young servant. "Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you." The command not to fear acknowledged what both parties knew. There would be much to fear. Jeremiah was not being sent to a receptive audience hungry for divine truth and eager to repent. He was being sent to a stubborn people, to hostile leaders, to religious establishments that had vested interests in silencing prophetic voices that threatened their comfortable arrangements. Fear was the appropriate emotional response to such a calling. Anyone who was not afraid was either foolish or delusional, but appropriate or not, fear was not permitted to govern Jeremiah's decisions. "Do not be afraid of them" was not a suggestion that fear might be counterproductive. It was a command to resist the fear that would inevitably arise, to refuse it the controlling position it would seek to claim, to act in faith even when every natural instinct screamed for retreat and self-preservation. The basis for this command to fearlessness was not Jeremiah's own strength or skill or cleverness. It was presence. "I am with you." The same God who had known Jeremiah before his birth would remain with Jeremiah throughout his ministry. The one who had called him would not abandon him to face the consequences of obedience alone. Divine presence would accompany divine commission, ensuring that the prophet was never truly isolated, no matter how isolated he might feel, and will rescue you. The promise of rescue implied that there would be situations from which rescue was necessary, dangers, threats, moments when Jeremiah's life or freedom hung in the balance. The calling was not being presented as safe or comfortable. It was being presented as dangerous but not fatal, threatening but not ultimately destructive, terrifying but undergirded by a promise that God would bring his prophet through whatever he led his prophet into. The rescue might not come as quickly as Jeremiah would prefer, might not arrive in the form he expected, might not prevent suffering and hardship along the way, but it would come. The God who spoke these words was committing himself to Jeremiah's ultimate deliverance. And then came the moment that would seal the calling in Jeremiah's memory forever. Then the Lord reached out his hand and touched my mouth. The gesture was intimate, physical, shocking in its directness. God reached out, the creator of the universe, the one before whom angels covered their faces, the Holy One whose glory filled the heavens, reached out toward this trembling young man from Anathoth. And he touched Jeremiah's mouth, that very organ which the young man had just confessed was inadequate for the task being assigned. The part of Jeremiah's body that he felt most unqualified was the part God chose to touch. The touch was transformative. This was not a casual gesture of encouragement, a divine pat on the back to make Jeremiah feel better about himself. This was consecration, empowerment, the impartation of something that Jeremiah did not previously possess. The hand of God carried what the hand of God always carries when it touches human vessels: the capacity to do what was previously impossible, the ability to become what nature had not equipped one to become, the potential for ministry that could not emerge from human talent alone. I have put my words in your mouth. The mouth that Jeremiah had called inadequate was now filled with something far more powerful than eloquence: divine words. Not ideas that Jeremiah would need to translate into his own vocabulary, not concepts that he would have to articulate as best he could with his limited rhetorical skills, but the very words of God placed in his mouth like burning coals that would emerge as prophetic fire. The word of the Lord that had come to Jeremiah was now placed within him, available to pour forth whenever God determined it should flow. This was the answer to Jeremiah's confession of inadequacy. He had said he did not know how to speak. God had responded by providing exactly what would be spoken. The pressure was removed from Jeremiah to craft compelling messages on his own, to find the right words through his own wisdom, to persuade through his own power. His task was simpler and more demanding: to speak what God had placed in his mouth, nothing more and nothing less. Simpler because he did not need to generate the content. More demanding because he was now responsible for words that were not his own, accountable to deliver a message whose power and significance infinitely exceeded anything he could have composed. Jeremiah felt the weight of those words settling into his being, a warmth and a burning that would never fully fade throughout his decades of ministry. The touch on his mouth was a moment he would return to again and again in the difficult years ahead, when audiences rejected his messages, when kings threatened his life, when even other prophets contradicted his words, when he sat in cisterns and dungeons and watched everything he loved being destroyed. He would remember, God touched my mouth. God placed his words within me. What I speak is not my own invention, but divine commission. The touch also carried responsibility. A mouth filled with God's words was not free to speak other words that contradicted them. Jeremiah could not deliver divine oracles in the temple courts and then contradict them in private conversations. He could not prophesy one thing and live another. The words placed in his mouth would govern his entire existence, would shape not just his public ministry, but his private identity. He was becoming a vessel for divine communication, and vessels must remain consistent with their contents. Then came the commission itself, 6 verbs that would define the scope and nature of Jeremiah's prophetic ministry. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. The authority was staggering. This young man who moments ago had protested that he was too young to speak was now being appointed over nations and kingdoms, not just Judah, not just the immediate context of his calling, but the great powers whose interactions would shape the history of the ancient world. Jeremiah would speak words that addressed Babylon's rise and Egypt's fall, that proclaimed judgment on surrounding nations and hope for scattered exiles, that operated on an international stage even though the prophet himself would never leave the tiny territory of Judah and its environs. But the content of the appointment was even more striking than its scope. 6 verbs arranged in a pattern that revealed the nature of divine work through prophetic ministry. 4 verbs of destruction: to uproot, to tear down, to destroy, to overthrow. 2 verbs of construction: to build, to plant. The proportion was significant and unsettling. Jeremiah's ministry would be predominantly about destruction, about announcing judgment, about declaring that what seemed permanent was about to be removed. He would uproot what had been planted in Israel's soil, the false confidence, the corrupt institutions, the idolatrous practices that had taken root across generations. He would tear down what had been built, the assumptions of security, the structures of religious hypocrisy, the towers of human pride that reached toward heaven in defiance of divine authority. He would destroy and overthrow kingdoms and dynasties, powers and principalities, everything that stood in the way of God's purposes. This was not the calling Jeremiah might have hoped for. A prophet who built and planted, who encouraged and comforted, who announced blessing and prosperity. That would have been easier to embrace, easier to deliver, easier to live with. But Judah's spiritual condition did not permit such a ministry. Before building could happen, ground had to be cleared. Before planting could occur, roots of corruption had to be removed. The surgery that Judah needed was radical, and the surgeon being appointed would have to make incisions that would cause screaming before they could bring healing. Yet the commission did not end with destruction. After the 4 verbs of tearing down came 2 verbs of restoration. Jeremiah would also build and plant. There would be hope beyond judgment, restoration beyond destruction, new growth in the cleared ground where old corruptions had been removed. The ratio might seem weighted toward the negative, but the final words pointed toward something positive, something generative, something that looked past the immediate suffering toward a future that God was already planning, even as he announced the demolition of the present. The young man who had felt too young, too inarticulate, too inadequate for prophetic ministry stood transformed. He had not become eloquent in human terms. He had not suddenly aged into the grey-haired sage that people might have expected. He had not acquired through his own effort any of the qualifications he had believed he lacked. But he had received something far more significant: the touch of God, the words of God, the commission of God. He was a prophet now, even though he barely understood what that meant. He had been appointed over nations and kingdoms, even though he had never left the environs of Jerusalem. He carried in his mouth words that would uproot and tear down, destroy and overthrow, and ultimately build and plant. Words whose power came not from his delivery, but from their divine origin. The encounter was not yet complete. God had more to show his young prophet, visions that would begin his training for the ministry ahead. But the essential commissioning had occurred. Jeremiah had been called before his birth, objected in his youth, been touched by divine hand, and received divine words. Whatever came next, he would face it not as an ordinary young man from a priestly village, but as a prophet to the nations, his mouth burning with words that were not his own, his life no longer his own, his future already written in the counsels of a God who had known him before he existed, and who would never leave him alone in the calling he had placed upon him. The touch of fire remained on his lips, and the fire would burn for decades to come. The commissioning was complete, but the training was just beginning. God had touched Jeremiah's mouth and placed divine words within him, but the young prophet needed more than words. He needed understanding. He needed to see what God saw, to perceive the spiritual realities beneath the surface of political events, to comprehend the trajectory on which Judah was travelling, even while the nation remained oblivious to its own danger. And so God began to teach his prophet through visions, images burned into Jeremiah's consciousness that would shape his understanding of his ministry and his message. What do you see, Jeremiah? The question was an invitation to look, to pay attention, to exercise the prophetic perception that would become one of Jeremiah's most essential tools. Prophets were seers. The old word for prophet in Israel had been seer, one who saw what others could not see, who perceived what remained hidden from ordinary eyes. God was training Jeremiah to see, and the training began with a simple object that would have been familiar to anyone in the Judean countryside. I see the branch of an almond tree. The almond tree was one of the first trees to bloom in the land of Israel, its white and pink blossoms appearing in late winter, while other trees remained dormant. Its Hebrew name, shaked, came from a root meaning to watch, or to be wakeful. The tree that wakes first, the tree that watches for spring while the world still sleeps in winter's grip. It was an ordinary sight, nothing that would have caught the attention of a casual observer walking through the groves around Anathoth. But in the context of prophetic vision, the ordinary was about to become extraordinary. "You have seen correctly," God affirmed, "for I am watching to see that my word is fulfilled." The wordplay in Hebrew was unmistakable. The almond branch, shaked, became a picture of divine watchfulness, shocked. God was the watcher who never slept, the vigilant one who observed the unfolding of history with perfect attention, the guardian who ensured that every word he spoke would come to pass exactly as spoken. The image carried both comfort and warning. Comfort, because the words of promise and restoration that God would speak through Jeremiah were being watched over, guaranteed, protected from failure by divine vigilance. Warning, because the words of judgment were being watched over with equal intensity. No syllable of announced consequence would fall to the ground unfulfilled. Jeremiah absorbed the lesson. The God who had called him was not a distant deity who issued decrees and then forgot about them. He was actively watching, moment by moment, ensuring that his purposes moved toward their appointed fulfillment. The prophetic word was not a guess about what might happen, or a threat that might be retracted if circumstances changed. It was a declaration backed by the watching presence of the one who had spoken it, as certain as the almond's annual awakening, as reliable as spring following winter. This understanding would sustain Jeremiah through decades of apparent failure. He would speak words of judgment and see his audience ignore them. He would announce consequences and watch his society continue unchanged. He would proclaim divine verdicts and witness the people behaving as if nothing had been said. In those moments of apparent futility, the image of the almond branch would return to him. God was watching. God's word would be fulfilled. The delay between speaking and accomplishment did not indicate divine forgetfulness, but divine patience. And when the patience had run its course, the watching God would act. Then came the second vision, darker and more ominous than the first. "What do you see?" Jeremiah looked again, and this time the image was not peaceful but violent, not comforting but terrifying. "I see a pot that is boiling. It is tilting toward us from the north." The boiling pot was a cauldron set over fire, its contents churning and bubbling with heat that would scald anything it touched. In the ancient world, the image carried associations with military invasion. Armies that swept across territories like boiling liquid spilling from an overturned vessel. Destruction that flowed outward from its source to consume everything in its path. The pot in Jeremiah's vision was not stationary but tilting, tipping, about to pour its deadly contents in a specific direction. From the north. The geography of the ancient Near East made the north the direction from which invasion typically came to the land of Israel. The Arabian Desert to the east and south made direct assault from those directions impractical for large armies. Egypt lay to the southwest, accessible along the coastal route, but the truly devastating invasions, Assyria's conquest of the northern kingdom, the various Mesopotamian powers that had threatened or conquered the region throughout history, came from the north, following the Fertile Crescent around the desert, and then sweeping down through Syria into the smaller kingdoms that lay in their path. God interpreted the vision for his young prophet. From the north, disaster will be poured out on all who live in the land. I am about to summon all the peoples of the northern kingdoms. Their kings will come and set up their thrones in the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem. They will come against all her surrounding walls and against all the towns of Judah. The words were specific and devastating. This was not a vague warning about potential danger, not a general reminder that nations faced consequences for sin. This was a concrete prediction of military catastrophe. Foreign armies would surround Jerusalem, would besiege its walls, would devastate the towns of Judah that lay outside the capital's protection. Thrones set up in the entrance of gates meant conquest, occupation, the replacement of Judean authority with foreign domination. The boiling pot was not merely tilting, it was about to overflow, and Judah lay directly in the path of the scalding flood. I will pronounce my judgments on my people, because of their wickedness in forsaking me, in burning incense to other gods, and in worshipping what their hands have made. The cause of the coming disaster was not political miscalculation or military weakness, though both would play their roles in Judah's eventual fall. The root cause was spiritual. The nation had forsaken the God who had delivered them from Egypt, had bound himself to them in covenant, had given them the land they now inhabited. They had turned to other gods, the Baals, the Asherahs, the Astral, deities whose worship had infiltrated every level of society. They had worshipped what their hands had made, bowing down before carved images and molten statues, treating the work of human craftsmen as if it possessed divine power. The judgment would be proportionate to the offence. A nation that had rejected the true God would be rejected by him, handed over to the consequences of their choices, allowed to experience what life was like without divine protection. The northern kingdoms, ultimately this meant Babylon, would serve as instruments of divine judgment, their military ambitions coinciding with God's purposes, their conquests accomplishing what divine displeasure had decreed. Jeremiah stood in the presence of God, the two visions burning in his mind, and felt the weight of what he now knew settling upon his shoulders. The almond branch and the boiling pot. God was watching, and what God saw was a catastrophe approaching from the north. The young prophet had been given insight into a future that his contemporaries could not perceive, and that insight was not a privilege but a burden. He would walk among people who did not know what he knew, who could not see what he saw, who remained blind to the disaster racing toward them, even as they went about their daily lives in comfortable ignorance. This was the peculiar suffering of prophetic foresight. To see disaster before it comes is to carry a weight that cannot be shared, to grieve losses that have not yet occurred, to mourn a future that others are still busy planning as if it would unfold normally. Jeremiah would spend the next 40 years watching his beloved nation walk step by step toward the catastrophe he had already seen in vision, unable to turn their steps aside, unable to make them see what was so clear to his prophetically opened eyes. The vision of the boiling pot would haunt him. In quiet moments, in sleepless nights, in the midst of ordinary days when others laughed and celebrated and conducted business as usual, Jeremiah would see that cauldron tilting from the north, its scalding contents about to pour out over everything he loved. He would hear the sound of armies that had not yet assembled, see the flames of cities that had not yet burned, feel the grief of exile that had not yet begun. The burden of knowing was heavier than anyone who has not carried it can imagine. Yet the knowledge also clarified his purpose. He had not been called merely to deliver messages, but to prepare his people for what was coming. Every oracle he would speak, every warning he would deliver, every confrontation he would endure with hostile audiences was aimed at one goal: turning Judah from the path that led to the boiling pot. If the nation would repent, if the people would return to the God they had forsaken, if the tide of idolatry could be reversed before the tide of invasion arrived, perhaps the disaster could be averted. The prophecies of judgment were not fates sealed beyond alteration, but warnings given precisely because alteration was still possible. This understanding would make Jeremiah's eventual failure all the more painful. He would warn, and they would not listen. He would plead, and they would ignore him. He would weep over the coming destruction, and they would mock his tears. The prophet who saw more clearly than anyone else in his generation would spend his entire ministry watching his generation choose the path that led to exactly what he had predicted. The boiling pot would eventually overflow. The northern armies would eventually come. Everything Jeremiah had seen in vision would become reality in history. But that was still decades away. For now, the young prophet stood at the beginning of his ministry, newly commissioned, freshly instructed, his mouth touched by divine hand and his mind filled with divine vision. He knew more now than he had known that morning, knew his calling, knew his authority, knew the content of his essential message, knew the resistance he would face and the presence that would sustain him. He was not ready, not in any human sense of readiness, but he was called, and the one who called him was watching to fulfill every word he had spoken. God issued a final charge before the encounter concluded. Get yourself ready, stand up and say to them whatever I command you. Do not be terrified by them, or I will terrify you before them. Today I have made you a fortified city, an iron pillar and a bronze wall to stand against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the people of the land. They will fight against you but will not overcome you, for I am with you and will rescue you. The imagery of fortification was striking. Jeremiah would not be given an easy audience or a receptive message. He would face opposition from every sector of Judean society. Kings who did not want to hear that their policies were leading to disaster, officials who benefited from the corrupt status quo, priests whose religious establishment would be threatened by genuine reform, common people who preferred the comfortable lies of false prophets to the uncomfortable truth of divine word. Everyone would fight against him. The young man from Anathoth would become an object of national hostility, rejected by the very people he was trying to save, but he would not be overcome. The God who made him a fortified city would maintain the fortification. The one who made him an iron pillar would prevent him from being bent. The presence that had promised rescue would deliver on that promise, again and again, through dangers and imprisonments and moments when it seemed certain that Jeremiah would be silenced permanently. The opposition would be fierce, but it would not be final. The attacks would come, but they would not succeed. Jeremiah would stand because God would make him stand, and the gates of Jerusalem would fall before the prophet of God would fall. The encounter ended, but its effects would last a lifetime. Jeremiah returned to his ordinary existence, to Anathoth, to his family, to the rhythms of life in a priestly village. But nothing was ordinary anymore. He had seen an almond branch and learned that God was watching. He had seen a boiling pot and learned that judgment was coming. He had received a calling that he had not sought, and a burden he had not chosen, and both would remain with him until his last breath. The training had begun. The visions had been given. The fire burned on lips that would now have to open and speak, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the horizon, the armies of Babylon were already beginning to stir. The time came, as it always does, when the private encounter with God had to become public proclamation. Jeremiah could not remain in Anathoth forever, nursing his visions in solitude, holding the divine words within him like a secret too precious or too dangerous to share. The calling that had been given demanded expression. The mouth that had been touched had to open. The prophet who had been appointed over nations and kingdoms had to actually speak to someone. The temple courtyard in Jerusalem was the logical place for a prophet to begin his public ministry. It was the centre of religious life for the nation, the place where worshippers gathered for festivals and sacrifices, where priests performed their duties and Levites sang their psalms, where the presence of God was believed to dwell in special measure. If Jeremiah was to address Judah with divine words, the temple was where Judah could be found in concentrated form. Not just the residents of Jerusalem, but pilgrims from throughout the kingdom, gathered to fulfill their religious obligations and seek divine blessing. The walk from Anathoth to Jerusalem was only about 3 miles, a journey Jeremiah had made many times before. But on this day, the familiar path felt different. Each step brought him closer to a moment he simultaneously dreaded and felt compelled toward. A confrontation he would have avoided if avoidance had been permitted. His legs carried him forward while his heart urged him to turn back. His mouth formed silent prayers for courage, while his mind rehearsed every reason why this task should have been given to someone else. The conflict within him was intense, a war between competing loyalties and fears that would characterize his entire ministry. He loved his people. That was part of what made the calling so painful. These were not abstractions he had been sent to address, not statistics or populations or demographic categories. These were his neighbours, his relatives, his fellow Israelites whose ancestors had stood at Sinai alongside his ancestors, whose history was his history, whose fate would be his fate. He loved them, and the message he carried was not one of comfort but of confrontation, not blessing but warning, not the assurance they wanted but the truth they needed. He also felt pain over their sins, a grief that went beyond intellectual disapproval to something closer to physical ache. He had seen the idolatry that had infected his nation, the altars on every hilltop and the shrines in every home, the religious syncretism that mixed worship of Weirwitch with worship of Baal, until the distinction between them had been lost. He had witnessed the corruption of justice, the exploitation of the poor, the arrogance of leaders who claimed divine favour while violating divine commands. The sins of Judah were not theoretical to Jeremiah. They were concrete realities he had observed with his own eyes, and they broke his heart even as they kindled in him the fire of prophetic indignation. And beneath love and pain there was fear. Fear of rejection, fear of mockery, fear of the hostility that the visions had already warned him to expect. Jeremiah was not a natural public speaker. He had not sought a platform or cultivated an audience. He was being thrust onto a stage he had never wanted to occupy, handed a script he had not written, expected to perform before a crowd that would likely respond with everything from indifference to violence. The prospect was terrifying, and no amount of divine assurance could entirely eliminate the terror that human nature feels when facing opposition. He entered Jerusalem through one of the northern gates, joining the flow of traffic that moved through the ancient city's narrow streets. The noise of commerce surrounded him, merchants hawking their wares, animals being driven to market, the general bustle of urban life that contrasted so sharply with the quiet of his village. He made his way toward the Temple Mount, climbing the steps that generations of pilgrims had climbed, passing through the gates that separated the sacred precinct from the ordinary city below. The temple courtyard was crowded as it often was. Worshippers moved about their business, some heading toward the altar with animals for sacrifice, others emerging from completed rituals, still others simply present in the sacred space, seeking proximity to divine presence. Priests in their distinctive garments performed their duties with practiced efficiency. The smell of incense mingled with the smell of burning flesh. The sounds of liturgical singing rose from the Levitical choir. Everything seemed normal, routine, the religious machinery of a nation that considered itself blessed by God and protected by his presence in their midst. Jeremiah found a place where he could be seen and heard, a spot where the acoustics of the courtyard would carry his voice to those nearby, where the traffic patterns of worshippers would bring many people within range of his words. He stood there for a moment, gathering himself, feeling the weight of divine words pressing against his lips like water behind a dam, knowing that once he began speaking, everything would change. And then he spoke. The words that emerged were not his own composition, not a message he had, crafted through careful preparation, not the polished rhetoric of a trained orator. They were the words God had placed in his mouth, raw and unvarnished, burning with an urgency that his halting delivery could not diminish. He spoke of covenant betrayal, of a nation that had forsaken the fountain of living water to dig broken cisterns that could hold no water. He spoke of spiritual adultery, of a bride who had abandoned her husband and given herself to strangers. He spoke of judgment approaching from the north, of destruction that would fall upon a people who had chosen destruction by their own persistent unfaithfulness. The reaction was everything the visions had prepared him to expect, and yet experiencing it was nothing like merely anticipating it. Some laughed. They saw a young man, clearly too young to be a serious prophet, lacking the grey beard and the authoritative presence of established religious figures, standing in the temple courtyard claiming to speak for God. The presumption was amusing, the message so contrary to the comfortable assumptions of the day that it could only be a joke or a sign of mental instability. They laughed and moved on, dismissing him as one dismisses a street performer whose act fails to entertain. Some grew angry. These were people invested in the religious status quo, people who benefited from the current arrangement of priests and prophets who assured the nation of divine favour, people who did not appreciate having their comfortable assumptions challenged by an unknown youth from a village outside the capital. Their anger showed in their faces, in the hostile muttering that passed between them, in the gathering energy of opposition that could easily turn violent if the proper spark was struck. They did not laugh at Jeremiah. They glared at him with eyes that warned of consequences if he continued this disruptive behaviour. And some, perhaps the largest group, were simply indifferent. They heard the words, registered them as one more voice among the many that competed for attention in the temple courtyard, and continued about their business without any significant response. They had come to offer sacrifices, not to have their worldview challenged. They had religious duties to perform, and this strange young prophet was not part of those duties. His message passed through their ears without penetrating their hearts, water rolling off a surface too smooth to absorb it. Jeremiah stood in the aftermath of his first prophetic utterance, surrounded by laughter and anger and indifference, and felt the loneliness of his calling settle around him like a cloak. This was what it would be like. This was what decades of ministry would hold. The same rejection in different forms, the same refusal to hear in different voices, the same isolation in different settings. He had spoken the words God gave him, had opened his mouth and let the fire emerge, and the response was exactly what had been predicted. Opposition from every quarter. Resistance from the very people he was trying to save. He returned to Anathoth that evening exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. The walk that had seemed so short in the morning now stretched endlessly before his weary feet. His throat was raw from speaking. His spirit was bruised from rejection. His mind replayed the faces he had seen, the laughing faces, the angry faces, the blank faces of those who simply did not care. And each replay deepened the wound that public ministry had opened. Yet even in his exhaustion, even in his discouragement, even in the aftermath of an experience that had confirmed every fear he had expressed, when God first called him, Jeremiah could not escape the words that still burned within him. He had spoken today, but he had not spoken everything. The message was not exhausted by a single delivery. The fire that God had placed in his mouth could not be satisfied by one public appearance and then allowed to fade. He would have to go back. He would have to speak again. He would have to face the laughter and the anger and the indifference over and over and over, because the calling that had been placed upon him was not a single task to be completed, but a lifetime commitment to be honoured. The struggle that raged within Jeremiah in those early days of his ministry mirrored the struggle that raged within the nation he was sent to address. Judah was torn between competing loyalties, to the God of their fathers and to the gods of their neighbours, to the covenant made at Sinai, and to the conveniences of religious syncretism, to the prophetic tradition that demanded righteousness, and to the priestly assurances that ritual observance was sufficient. The nation had not decisively chosen one path or the other. It wavered between options, sometimes moving toward genuine reform, and sometimes sliding back toward the idolatry that had characterized the worst periods of its history. Jeremiah's own wavering between obedience and reluctance, between speaking and silence, between faith and fear, reflected this national condition. He was not above his people, but among them, not immune to their struggles, but shaped by the same forces that shaped them. His calling was to speak truth to a conflicted nation, but he spoke as one who understood conflict from the inside, who knew what it was to feel pulled in different directions, who experienced in his own soul the battle between what God demanded and what human nature preferred. Perhaps this was part of why God had chosen him, not despite his reluctance, but because of it. A prophet who found the calling easy might have spoken with an arrogance that alienated his audience. A messenger who felt no internal conflict might have delivered judgment without the compassion that makes judgment bearable. Jeremiah's struggle was a gift to those who would eventually hear his words, a demonstration that obeying God did not require the elimination of human emotion, but the subordination of human emotion to divine command. He felt everything his audience would feel, the resistance, the fear, the desire to avoid uncomfortable truth, and he spoke anyway. That was the essence of prophetic obedience. The days that followed his first public appearance were difficult. He spoke again and was rejected again. He returned to the temple courtyard and encountered the same mixture of mockery, hostility, and apathy. He began to develop the thick skin that prophetic ministry required, the ability to continue speaking when no one seemed to be listening, the capacity to persist in obedience even when obedience produced no visible results. He learned that faithfulness was measured not by outcomes but by consistency, not by the response of his audience but by the authenticity of his message. He also learned that the calling was unavoidable. There were moments when he considered simply stopping, returning to the quiet life of a priestly family in Anathoth, abandoning the public ministry that brought him nothing but pain. But when he tried to remain silent, the words built up within him like pressure in a sealed vessel, demanding release, refusing to be contained. He could not stop speaking any more than he could stop breathing. The fire that God had placed in his mouth would not be extinguished by discouragement or silenced by opposition. It burned whether he wanted it to burn or not, and the only relief came from letting it out. If I say, I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, Jeremiah would later write, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. The reluctant prophet had stepped forward. The first words had been spoken. The ministry that would consume his entire adult life had begun. And though the path ahead would be harder than anything he could yet imagine, full of suffering, rejection, imprisonment, and the agony of watching everything he loved be destroyed, he would walk that path because he had no choice, because the calling that had been placed upon him before his birth could not be escaped by the person into whom he had been born. Obedience was costly, but the calling was unavoidable. And so Jeremiah continued, one reluctant step at a time, into the future that God had appointed for him. The years accumulated, and with them, the weight of prophetic ministry pressed ever heavier upon Jeremiah's shoulders. What had begun as a young man's trembling first words in the temple courtyard became a decades-long confrontation with an entire society determined to reject the message God had given. Jeremiah found himself standing against kings who did not want to hear of coming judgment, against priests who profited from the corrupt religious establishment, against prophets who spoke comfortable lies while claiming divine authority, against a population so committed to their chosen path that no warning could turn them from it. The kings of Judah passed before him like figures in a tragic procession. Good King Josiah, whose reforms had offered such hope, was killed in battle at Megiddo when he foolishly tried to block Pharaoh Necho's march northward. His death marked the end of any serious possibility of national repentance. The kings who followed, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim, Zedekiah, were lesser men in every way, some merely weak and others actively wicked, none capable of the moral leadership that might have averted the catastrophe Jeremiah continued to announce. Jehoiakim was perhaps the worst of them, a king who embodied everything that was wrong with Judah's ruling class. He built elaborate palaces using forced labour while the poor went hungry. He rejected prophetic warnings with contempt, on one occasion taking a scroll containing Jeremiah's prophecies and cutting it apart section by section, feeding each piece into the fire that burned in his winter brazier until the entire document was consumed. The act was meant to demonstrate his power over prophetic words, his ability to silence voices he did not wish to hear. It demonstrated instead his blindness, his inability to understand that burning a scroll did not nullify the reality it described, that the boiling pot from the north would overflow regardless of royal displeasure with those who announced its coming. The priests were no better. The religious establishment that should have taught the law and called the people to covenant faithfulness had instead become a mechanism for maintaining the status quo. Priests collected their portions while ignoring the corruption around them. They assured worshippers that temple sacrifices guaranteed divine protection, that the rituals performed on the great altar were sufficient to maintain God's favour regardless of how the worshippers lived the rest of their days. They hated Jeremiah because he threatened their comfortable arrangement, because his message suggested that their entire religious enterprise was built on sand, because if he was right about coming judgment, then they were complicit in the nation's destruction. But it was the false prophets who wounded Jeremiah most deeply. These were men who claimed to speak for God just as he did, who stood in the same temple courtyard and addressed the same crowds, who insisted that their messages of peace and prosperity were as divinely authorized as his messages of judgment and doom. They spoke what the people wanted to hear, that all was well, that God was pleased, that the prosperity they enjoyed would continue, that no disaster could befall a nation so blessed by divine favor. They contradicted Jeremiah directly and publicly, leaving audiences to choose between their comfortable assurances and his uncomfortable warnings. The prophets prophesy lies in my name, God confirmed to Jeremiah. I have not sent them, or appointed them, or spoken to them. They are prophesying to you false visions, divinations, idolatries, and the delusions of their own minds. But knowing that his opponents were false prophets did not make opposing them easier. The crowds preferred their message to his. The authorities found their assurances more convenient than his warnings. The competition for prophetic credibility was uneven, weighted heavily toward those who told people what they wanted to believe. Jeremiah spoke of weeping and destruction. The false prophets spoke of peace and blessing. Jeremiah called for repentance and warned of consequences. The false prophets offered divine approval for the nation's current course. In such a contest, popularity would never be on Jeremiah's side. The emotional toll of this ministry was immense, and Jeremiah did not suffer in silence. Unlike some prophets whose inner lives remain hidden behind their public proclamations, Jeremiah poured out his heart in laments that have been preserved in Scripture, Raw, honest, sometimes shocking prayers that reveal the depths of his struggle. These confessions of Jeremiah, as scholars have called them, offer an unprecedented window into the soul of a prophet who found his calling almost unbearable and yet could not escape it. "Cursed be the day I was born," Jeremiah cried out in one of his darkest moments. "May the day my mother bore me not be blessed. Cursed be the man who brought my father the news, who made him very glad, saying, 'A child is born to you, a son.' May that man be like the towns the Lord overthrew without pity. May he hear wailing in the morning, a battle cry at noon. For he did not kill me in the womb, with my mother as my grave, her womb enlarged forever. Why did I ever come out of the womb to see trouble and sorrow, and to end my days in shame?" The words were brutal in their honesty. This was not the composed spirituality of someone who had transcended human emotion through mystical discipline. This was a man in agony, wishing he had never been born, cursing the messenger who had announced his birth as good news. The prophet who had been told that God knew him before he was formed in the womb was now wishing that formation had never occurred, that the calling placed upon him before birth had been placed upon someone else, or upon no one at all. Other laments revealed different dimensions of his struggle. There was confusion about God's ways, the bewilderment of a faithful servant who could not understand why his obedience produced only suffering. "You are always righteous, Lord, when I bring a case before you. Yet I would speak with you about your justice. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all the faithless live at ease?" The question was ancient, older than Job, older than the wisdom tradition that had wrestled with it for generations. But it was also immediate, personal, burning with the specific anguish of a prophet who had sacrificed everything to speak God's truth and watched the liars flourish while he suffered. The false prophets were honoured. Jeremiah was despised. The corrupt priests lived in comfort. Jeremiah faced constant threat. The wicked prospered, and the faithless lived at ease, while the one who had been faithful from his youth endured loneliness, rejection, and physical danger. Where was the justice in that? How could a righteous God allow such inversion of what should be? There was also isolation, the crushing loneliness of standing apart from everyone around him. "I never sat in the company of revellers, never made merry with them. I sat alone because your hand was on me, and you had filled me with indignation." Jeremiah had been set apart before birth, and that setting apart extended into every dimension of his existence. He could not simply enjoy the pleasures that others enjoyed, could not participate in the celebrations that marked community life, could not belong in the ordinary ways that human beings belong to one another. The prophetic burden isolated him from normal human experience, filled him with an indignation that others did not share, made him a stranger among his own people. He sat alone because God's hand was upon him, and though that hand was the source of his calling and his significance, it was also the source of his separation from everything that made life bearable. And there were moments when the isolation produced something close to accusation, when Jeremiah's prayers became complaints directed at the God who had called him. "Why is my pain unending and my wound grievous and incurable? You are to me like a deceptive brook, like a spring that fails." The image was devastating. A deceptive brook was a stream that appeared to offer water, but went dry when the thirsty traveller arrived. A spring that promised refreshment, but failed when refreshment was most needed. Jeremiah was suggesting that God had deceived him, had lured him into prophetic ministry with promises of presence and rescue and then failed to deliver, had proven unreliable at precisely the moments when reliability mattered most. It was an astonishing thing for a prophet to say about the God he served, a complaint so raw that later readers might be tempted to dismiss it as merely rhetorical. But God did not dismiss it. God did not rebuke Jeremiah for the complaint or punish him for the accusation. Instead, God responded to his prophet's honest anguish with continued presence, continued guidance, continued companionship through the darkest valleys of prophetic experience. "If you repent, I will restore you that you may serve me. If you utter worthy, not worthless words, you will be my spokesman. Let this people turn to you, but you must not turn to them. I will make you a wall to this people, a fortified wall of bronze. They will fight against you, but will not overcome you, for I am with you to rescue you and save you." The response was not a solution to Jeremiah's problems, but a reaffirmation of his calling. God did not promise that the suffering would end or that the enemies would disappear or that the isolation would be relieved. He promised presence, the same presence he had promised at the beginning, the same "I am with you" that had undergirded the original commission. The circumstances would remain difficult, but the companionship would remain constant. This pattern repeated throughout Jeremiah's ministry. He would cry out in anguish, and God would respond with reassurance. He would express his weariness and his desire to quit, and God would remind him of the calling that could not be abandoned. He would accuse God of failing him, and God would patiently reaffirm the promises that had been made from the beginning. The relationship between the prophet and his God was not a relationship of distant command and mechanical obedience, but an intimate, sometimes contentious, always honest dialogue between two parties bound together by a calling that neither would revoke. The tenderness of God toward his struggling prophet emerged in unexpected moments. When Jeremiah felt utterly alone, God reminded him that divine presence was more real than human companionship. When he felt that his words were accomplishing nothing, God assured him that the prophetic word was being watched over, that every syllable would find its fulfillment. When he despaired of his own ability to continue, God renewed the strength that had been given at the beginning, the iron pillar and bronze wall that would not be broken regardless of the forces arrayed against them. There were practical rescues as well. Jeremiah was thrown into a cistern to die, and God sent an Ethiopian eunuch named Ebed-Melech to pull him out of the mud. He was imprisoned for his prophecies, and God opened doors that his enemies thought they had locked permanently. He was threatened with death more times than the text records, and each time he emerged alive to continue speaking the words that made him such a target. The promise, "I will rescue you," was not merely spiritual comfort but practical reality, demonstrated again and again in circumstances where human calculation would have predicted his destruction. Through all of this, Jeremiah's journey became a portrait of something larger than one man's ministry. It became a picture of divine companionship in human weakness. The God who called Jeremiah did not call him because he was strong, but precisely because he was weak. Because his weakness would display divine strength. Because his inability would showcase divine ability. Every moment of doubt, every prayer of complaint, every confession of inadequacy served to illuminate the truth that the prophetic ministry was never about the prophet. It was about the God who spoke through the prophet, who sustained the prophet, who remained faithful even when the prophet himself was too exhausted to feel faithful. Jeremiah never became comfortable with his calling. He never reached a place of serene acceptance where the suffering no longer mattered and the opposition no longer wounded. He remained reluctant to the end, a man who would have chosen a different life if the choice had been his to make. But his reluctance did not disqualify him. His struggles did not diminish his authority. His honest anguish did not separate him from the God who had called him. If anything, his weakness made him more useful, more relatable, more capable of speaking to others who found obedience difficult and faith demanding. Future generations who read his words would see in him a mirror of their own struggles, would find in his honest prayers permission for their own honest prayers, would discover in his story the assurance that divine calling does not require human perfection, that God works through broken vessels, that the same hand that touches our mouths with fire also catches us when we fall. The prophet remained stubborn against a stubborn people, but his stubbornness was not his own achievement. It was the gift of a God who refused to let go, who answered complaints with presence, who met accusations with patience, who walked with his reluctant prophet through every dark valley and brought him out again on the other side. This was what it meant to be called before birth. This was what it looked like to carry divine words in a human mouth. And this was the companionship that made it possible. Not a relationship that eliminated struggle, but a presence that sustained through struggle, faithful when the prophet himself could not feel faithful, constant when everything else seemed to shift and fail. The decades passed, each one heavier than the last, until the prophecies that had seemed so distant when first spoken became the lived reality of a nation in collapse. Jeremiah had warned of the boiling pot tilting from the north, and now the scalding contents were pouring out over everything he loved. He had spoken of uprooting and tearing down, of destroying and overthrowing, and now he watched as Babylonian armies surrounded Jerusalem's walls, as famine stalked the streets, as the temple that had stood for 4 centuries was reduced to rubble and ash. The fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE was the culmination of everything Jeremiah had predicted and the confirmation of everything he had dreaded. He had spoken these words for 40 years, had warned this people again and again, had wept over the destruction he saw coming long before it arrived. Now the destruction was here, and his tears flowed not for a future calamity but for a present agony. The city was burning, the temple was falling. The people he had loved and pleaded with and raged against were being slaughtered or dragged into exile, their cries filling the air with the sound of a nation dying. They called him the weeping prophet, and the title was earned through decades of tears. Jeremiah wept when others celebrated, grieving over a future they could not see. He wept when others raged, mourning the destruction that their rebellion was bringing upon them. He wept when the destruction finally came, not with the satisfaction of a prophet vindicated, but with the anguish of a man watching his worst fears become reality. "Oh, that my head were a spring of water, and my eyes a fountain of tears," he had cried. "I would weep day and night for the slain of my people." The Book of Lamentations, traditionally attributed to Jeremiah, captured the depth of this grief in poetry that has echoed through every subsequent generation of sufferers. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she, who once was great among the nations. The words were not the cold observations of an outsider, but the agonized mourning of one who had watched the beloved die, who had pleaded for her life and failed to save her, who now sat among the ruins and gave voice to a sorrow too deep for ordinary speech. Yet even in the midst of destruction, even as the flames consumed the temple and the Babylonian soldiers led the survivors away in chains, Jeremiah's message contained seeds of hope that would eventually flower into new life. He had been commissioned not only to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, but also to build and to plant. The proportion had been weighted toward destruction, 4 verbs against 2, but the final words pointed toward restoration, and Jeremiah never forgot them. "I will bring them back to this land," God had promised through his weeping prophet. "I will build them up and not tear them down. I will plant them and not uproot them." The very vocabulary of the original commission was being reversed, the destruction giving way to construction, the uprooting giving way to planting. The exile would not last forever. The scattering would eventually become a gathering. The judgment that seemed so total was actually preparation for a restoration that would surpass anything the nation had previously known. The prophecy of the New Covenant, found in the 31st chapter of Jeremiah's book, represented the pinnacle of his hopeful vision. In the midst of announcing judgment, Jeremiah had been given words that reached beyond the immediate catastrophe toward a future that would transform the very nature of relationship between God and humanity. "The days are coming," declares the Lord, "when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke that covenant, though I was a husband to them. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." The old covenant had been written on tablets of stone, external to the people who received it, a set of commands that required constant effort to remember and obey. The new covenant would be different. It would be internalized, written not on stone but on hearts, not outside the people but within them. The law that had been transgressed for generations would become part of the very nature of those who received it, transforming obedience from external compliance to internal desire. This was the ultimate answer to the tragedy that Jeremiah had witnessed throughout his ministry. Judah had broken the covenant not because the covenant was flawed, but because human hearts were resistant, because external law could not change internal nature, because commandments carved in stone could not produce the righteousness they demanded. The new covenant addressed this fundamental problem by changing the location of the law from outside to inside, from tablets to hearts, from something that confronted the people to something that constituted them. Jeremiah did not live to see the new covenant inaugurated. He died in Egypt, according to tradition, taken there against his will by fleeing Judeans who rejected his counsel to remain in the land. Even to the end, he was rejected by the people he had served, overruled by those he had tried to guide, a prophet without honour in his own land and among his own people. His death was as lonely as his life had been. a final confirmation that faithfulness to God did not guarantee earthly reward. But his words survived. The scrolls that Jehoiakim had burned were rewritten, expanded, preserved through the chaos of conquest and exile. The prophecies that the false prophets had contradicted proved true, while their comfortable assurances proved hollow. The message that had been rejected in Jeremiah's lifetime became the foundation of the hope for generations that followed, read and studied and treasured by exiles in Babylon, by returnees in Jerusalem, by communities scattered across the ancient world who found in his words both explanation for their suffering and promise for their future. Centuries later, when Jesus of Nazareth stood in another temple courtyard and spoke of coming destruction, his words echoed with Jeremiah's legacy. When he drove out the merchants and accused the religious leaders of turning God's house into a den of robbers, he was quoting Jeremiah directly, connecting his ministry to the weeping prophet who had confronted similar corruption generations before. When he instituted the Lord's Supper and spoke of the cup as representing the new covenant in his blood, he was claiming fulfillment of what Jeremiah had prophesied, announcing that the internalized law and the transformed hearts were finally becoming reality. The writer of Hebrews would later quote the New Covenant passage at length, using Jeremiah's prophecy to explain what Jesus had accomplished: the obsolescence of the Old Covenant, the inauguration of the New, the writing of divine law on human hearts that had been promised through the weeping prophet and was now being realized through the suffering Messiah. Jeremiah's words had outlived not only the prophet himself, but the entire system he had known, reaching forward to interpret events that occurred more than 6 centuries after his death. This was the legacy of the reluctant prophet. Not success by any earthly measure, not honor in his own time, not the satisfaction of watching his audience repent and judgment be averted, but words that would outlast empires, truth that would survive the destruction of everything he knew, a message that would speak to generations he would never meet, about a God who remained faithful even when his people did not. For those who read Jeremiah's story across the millennia since, the message speaks with continued relevance to every human heart that has ever felt inadequate for divine calling. God still calls ordinary hearts into extraordinary purposes. This is the first lesson, the foundation upon which all the others rest. The young man from Anathoth was not special by any human standard of specialness. He was not eloquent, not confident, not equipped with natural gifts that made prophetic ministry an obvious fit. He was simply available, and divine calling transformed availability into ability, weakness into strength, reluctance into resilience. Fear does not disqualify calling. This is the second lesson, perhaps the most comforting for those who feel the weight of divine invitation pressing against their own inadequacy. Jeremiah was afraid from the beginning and remained afraid throughout his ministry. His confessions reveal a man who never stopped struggling, never achieved the serene confidence that some imagine spiritual maturity should produce. Yet God did not withdraw the calling because of the fear. He addressed the fear, answered the fear, provided presence that could sustain through fear, but he did not require fearlessness as a prerequisite for service. The calling came to a frightened young man and remained with him through a lifetime of frightening circumstances. Before we were born, God already knew who we could become. This is the third lesson, the deepest truth embedded in Jeremiah's story. The calling that came to the prophet in the 13th year of Josiah's reign was not an afterthought, not a response to circumstances, not a divine improvisation triggered by unexpected need. It was the fulfillment of a purpose that had been established before Jeremiah existed, the revelation of an identity that had been formed while he was still being formed, the announcement of what God had always known about a young man who was only beginning to know himself. This truth extends beyond Jeremiah to every human being who has ever wondered about purpose, about significance, about whether their existence matters in a universe so vast and old that individual lives can seem like dust in the wind. The God who knew Jeremiah before forming him in the womb is the same God who knows every person ever born, who forms each one with purpose, who sees what they can become before they have taken their first breath. The calling may not be to prophetic ministry, most callings are not, but it is no less real, no less intentional, no less watched over by the God who performs his word. The evening light falls across a world very different from the one Jeremiah knew, a world of technologies and complexities he could never have imagined, yet a world populated by human hearts that remain remarkably unchanged. We still feel inadequate. We still fear rejection. We still struggle to obey when obedience is costly. We still need the assurance that God is near, that calling is real, that the words placed in our mouths will accomplish what they are sent to accomplish, regardless of how they are received. The story of the reluctant prophet offers that assurance with a power that the centuries have not diminished. God still calls, God still equips, God still accompanies those he sends into difficult assignments, walking with them through rejection and suffering and apparent failure, sustaining them when they cannot sustain themselves, faithful when they are too exhausted to feel faithful. The touch of fire on Jeremiah's lips has become the touch of fire on countless lips since. Men and women who have spoken truth in difficult circumstances, who have confronted power with prophetic word, who have remained faithful when faithfulness brought suffering instead of reward. They are Jeremiah's heirs, continuing the ministry that began in a priestly village outside Jerusalem, carrying forward words that uproot and tear down, destroy and overthrow, and ultimately build and plant. And the God who called Jeremiah before his birth is still calling, still reaching out to touch mouths that feel inadequate, still placing divine words in human vessels, still promising presence that will not fail. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. The words were spoken to one young man in one moment of history, but they echo across every generation, inviting every reluctant heart to trust that the one who calls is also the one who equips, that the one who commissions is also the one who accompanies, that the purpose established before birth will be fulfilled despite every obstacle that stands in its way. Jeremiah was set apart before he was born, and in some measure, every person who hears his story is invited to discover the same truth about themselves, that they too are known, they too are formed with purpose, they too are called into a story larger than their own fears and inadequacies, a story that ends not in failure but in faithfulness, not in despair but in hope, not in destruction but in the building and planting that follows every necessary tearing down. This is the legacy of the reluctant prophet. This is the message that has outlasted empires and will outlast empires yet to come. And this is the invitation that still goes out to every heart that trembles before a calling too large to embrace. Do not be afraid. Do not say you are too young. The one who calls you knew you before you were born and will be with you until the work is complete. Rise, speak. Trust the fire on your lips. The God who called Jeremiah is still calling, and the promise that sustained the weeping prophet through decades of suffering sustains still, as certain as the almond branch's annual awakening, as reliable as spring following winter, as faithful as the God who watches over his word to perform it. Before you were born, he knew you, and he is with you still.